There is a version of the Vietnam War that was constructed carefully over years by people who understood that what soldiers actually experienced could not be allowed to exist in the public record in any form that might prove useful. Not useful to the enemy, useful to the truth. The version that was built instead had clean lines. It had press briefings in Saigon where journalists were handed numbers, and the numbers were always moving in the right direction. It had official casualty reports that bore little relationship to what medics were counting in the field. It had a strategic framework that sounded coherent in Washington and dissolved the moment anyone tried to apply it to a specific village in Quang Ngai Province on a Tuesday in 1968. The war that actually happened was something else. It was something that soldiers were asked to carry home and then quietly put down somewhere where it would not cause problems. Many of them tried. The ones who succeeded often found that what they had put down had not stayed where they left it. The first thing to understand is that the Vietnam War was not misunderstood. That framing, which became popular in the decades after 1975, implies that better communication, better journalism, better public education might have led to a different outcome, or at least a more honest accounting. That is not what the evidence shows. The war was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented systematically and deliberately by institutions that understood exactly what they were doing and why. The misrepresentation was not the product of confusion. It was the product of a system that had learned to generate plausible data in place of accurate data, and that had created incentive structures at every level of the military hierarchy that made honest reporting professionally dangerous. Soldiers in the field knew this. Officers in the field often knew this. The information moved upward and changed as it moved, and by the time it reached the levels where decisions were made, it bore almost no resemblance to what had actually occurred on the ground. This is where the story of what soldiers were told to forget actually begins. Not with specific atrocities, though those exist and will be addressed. Not with individual acts of cruelty or individual failures of command, though those also exist. It begins with something more structural and in some ways more disturbing. It begins with the way the entire apparatus of the war was designed to produce a particular kind of information and suppress another kind, and with what that did to the people who were living inside the gap between those two information streams. A soldier who served with the 1st Cavalry Division in 1966 described the experience this way, in testimony that was recorded but never widely distributed. He said that the hardest thing was not the fighting. The hardest thing was understanding that what he was doing and what was being reported about what he was doing were two completely different things, and that the reported version was the one that mattered, the one that determined promotions. The one that determined whether his unit was considered effective, the one that was sent back to the Pentagon and used to justify continued operations. The actual version, the one he was living inside, had no institutional existence. It happened, and then it was over, and then a different version of it was written down somewhere, and that was the version that persisted. Body count was the metric that defined the war more than any other single measurement. And the story of body count is the story of how a war can be conducted almost entirely within a self-referential system of data that has progressively less connection to physical reality. The body count doctrine emerged from Robert McNamara's Pentagon, from a managerial approach to warfare that believed conflict could be quantified and optimized the same way a manufacturing process could be quantified and optimized. The logic was straightforward on paper. If you were killing more of the enemy than they were killing of you, and if you were killing them at a rate that exceeded their ability to replace fighters, then you were winning. The ratio would eventually reach a point where continued resistance became impossible, and the war would end. The problem with this logic was not just that it was strategically flawed, though it was. The problem was what it required of the people who were supposed to generate the data. Every unit in Vietnam was under pressure to produce body counts. The numbers moved up the chain of command and were aggregated and presented as evidence of progress. A unit that produced high body counts was considered effective, A unit that produced low body counts was considered ineffective or possibly insufficiently aggressive. This created an incentive structure that had nothing to do with military reality and everything to do with institutional survival. Officers who wanted their careers to continue produced the numbers that the system required. The question of where those numbers came from was one that the system was not designed to ask. What actually happened in many cases was a process that soldiers who were there described with remarkable consistency. The unit would conduct an operation. There would be contact with enemy forces, or sometimes with people who might have been enemy forces, or sometimes with people who were in the wrong place. After the contact ended, someone had to produce a number. The number needed to be defensible, meaning it needed to be large enough to justify the operation, but not so large as to invite scrutiny. Weapons found at the site were counted. Sometimes weapons were carried specifically to be left at sites where they might be needed. People who had been killed were counted as enemy combatants, regardless of what they had actually been doing when they died. In some documented cases, the same bodies were counted multiple times as different units passed through the same area. The number that emerged from this process was called the body count, and it traveled upward through the command structure and was reported at the Saigon press briefings that journalists called the 5 o'clock follies. Because by 1967, almost everyone in the press corps understood that the numbers being presented there were not real numbers in any meaningful sense. The soldiers who were generating these numbers understood what they were doing. They had to understand it because they were the ones doing it, and they were told in various ways and with varying degrees of directness that this was how things worked, and that their job was to make things work this way. The psychological effect of this instruction was not neutral. A soldier who is told to participate in the systematic falsification of the record of what he is doing is being asked to accept a particular relationship to his own experience. He is being asked to understand that his experience is raw material for a narrative that someone else is constructing, and that his role in that construction is to provide inputs that produce the required outputs. The accuracy of those inputs is not the point. The outputs are the point. What this does to a person over time is not something that the Pentagon's managerial frameworks had any category for. There were soldiers who refused. Not many. And the ones who refused generally discovered that the institutional response was not appreciation for their honesty, but various forms of professional consequence, ranging from reassignment to unfavorable evaluations to the kind of social pressure within a unit that can be more effective than any formal punishment. The message was consistent. The system requires certain outputs, and your job is to produce them. And if you are unable to do that, then arrangements will be made to find someone who can. This message was rarely delivered explicitly. It did not need to be. The incentive structure communicated it clearly enough that most people received it without being told directly. What this meant in practice was that units were operating in an environment where the official record of what they were doing was being constructed alongside the actual record of what they were doing, and the two records were maintained simultaneously but separately. Soldiers lived inside the actual record, their official evaluations, their unit's performance metrics, their commanding officer's career trajectory. All of those things lived inside the official record. The gap between the two records was not something that could be discussed openly, because discussing it openly would require acknowledging that the official record was not accurate, and acknowledging that would have consequences. So the gap was maintained through a kind of collective silence that was itself a form of institutional knowledge. Everyone knew, and no one said, and the knowing and the not saying became part of the texture of the experience. The village of My Lai existed in this gap for 18 months before it entered the official record, and the way it entered the official record illustrates almost everything about how the system functioned. On March 16, 1968, elements of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, 11th Brigade, American Division entered the hamlet of My Lai and killed somewhere between 300 and 500 civilians. The official report generated in the immediate aftermath described a successful combat operation against Viet Cong forces, with 128 enemy killed in action and 3 weapons captured. The disproportion between the casualty figure and the weapons figure was the kind of thing that should have triggered scrutiny within any system designed to catch falsified reporting. It did not trigger scrutiny. The report moved through the system and became part of the official record, which is to say, it became part of the evidence of progress being presented to political leaders in Washington. The soldiers who were at My Lai were not told explicitly to forget what had happened there. They did not need to be. The official report already told them what had happened there, and the official report was what mattered. Some of them wrote letters home that were subsequently screened and returned with sections redacted. Some of them talked among themselves and understood, without being instructed, that talking to anyone outside the unit was not something that would end well for them. A warrant officer named Hugh Thompson, who had been flying a scout helicopter over the hamlet during the operation and had witnessed what was happening and had intervened to stop part of it and had filed a complaint through official channels, found that his complaint moved upward through the same system and produced no visible result for over a year. The system was not designed to process that kind of input. When the story finally broke, in late 1969, through the investigative work of Seymour Hersh, working entirely outside the military information system, the institutional response was revealing. There was an investigation, and there were courts-martial, and ultimately one person was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment and was paroled within 3 years by presidential intervention. The soldiers who had participated in the killings, the officers who had covered them up, the institutional mechanisms that had allowed the cover-up to function for 18 months, most of those things remained within the official record's capacity for accommodation. What My Lai proved, if it proved anything, was not that atrocities happened in Vietnam. Atrocities happened in every war. What it proved was that the system was capable of absorbing an atrocity of that scale and converting it into a body count figure and sending it up the chain of command without any mechanism triggering to question it. That was the system soldiers were living inside. The Phoenix program represents a different kind of instructed forgetting, because in this case the forgetting was built into the program's design rather than added afterward. Phoenix was a joint CIA military operation that ran from 1965 until the fall of Saigon, with its most intensive phase between 1968 and 1972. Its stated purpose was the neutralization of the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political and organizational network that supported the insurgency at the village and district level. In practice, this meant identifying suspected Viet Cong cadre, tax collectors, political organizers, local officials who had pledged loyalty to the National Liberation Front, and neutralizing them. Neutralization was a term that covered a range of outcomes, including capture, defection, and killing. The soldiers and intelligence officers and South Vietnamese provincial reconnaissance units who operated within Phoenix understood what neutralization meant in practice. They also understood that the program operated in a legal space that had been deliberately left undefined. The people they were targeting were not uniformed enemy combatants. They were, in many cases, civilians who were suspected of political affiliation with the enemy. The criteria for identifying a target were inconsistently applied across different provinces and different units, and the oversight mechanisms that might have imposed consistency were present on paper and largely absent in practice. An individual could be placed on a Phoenix target list on the basis of a single informant's accusation, and the informant might have personal reasons to make the accusation that had nothing to do with actual Viet Cong affiliation. By the program's own accounting, Phoenix was responsible for the neutralization of more than 80,000 people between 1968 and 1972, of whom approximately 20,000 were killed. These numbers were reported to Congress and generated significant controversy. What was not reported with equal clarity was the quality of the intelligence underlying those neutralizations. William Colby, who directed the program and later became CIA director, testified before Congress that the program had been effective and that the vast majority of those targeted had been genuine Viet Cong infrastructure. Veterans of the program described something considerably more complicated. Some provincial reconnaissance units were operating with target lists that were generated by informants who were paid by the name and therefore had strong incentives to produce names. Some operations were directed not at actual Viet Cong cadre, but at people who had refused to pay bribes, or people involved in local property disputes, or people whose names appeared on lists because someone with a grievance had provided them to an intelligence officer who had not verified the information. The soldiers and officers who operated within this system were not encouraged to ask questions about the quality of the intelligence they were acting on. The program had quotas. Each province was expected to neutralize a certain number of Viet Cong infrastructure per month. Whether the people being neutralized were actually Viet Cong infrastructure was a question that the quota system was structurally indifferent to. What mattered was the number, and the number needed to reach the target. And the people responsible for reaching the target understood that their performance evaluations would reflect whether they had reached it. The psychological experience of operating within this structure, of conducting operations against people who might or might not have been the designated enemy based on intelligence that might or might not have been reliable, while being evaluated on whether you were producing sufficient quantities of a result that was itself defined in terms that obscured what was actually happening, was not something that the program's architects had designed any mechanism to address. Veterans who spoke about Phoenix in the years after the war, and there were not many who spoke about it openly, described a consistent psychological pattern. They described learning not to think about the quality of the intelligence because thinking about it created problems that couldn't be resolved within the operational context. They described developing a relationship to their targets that was deliberately abstracted, meaning that thinking about a target as a specific person with specific circumstances was not something that the job permitted. They described understanding, without being told directly, that questions about whether a specific target was actually a Viet Cong cadre were questions that the system was not designed to answer, and that asking them loudly would not help anyone. And they described carrying home something that had no official existence because the official version of what they had done was contained entirely within the program's statistics, and those statistics described a counterinsurgency success that bore little relationship to what they had actually experienced. Fragging is a word that entered the American vocabulary during the Vietnam War and then largely disappeared from it afterward because what it described was something that the institutional narrative of the war had limited capacity to accommodate. Fragging referred to the killing of American officers by American enlisted soldiers, typically using fragmentation grenades, hence the term. The practice was not a marginal phenomenon. By the Army's own statistics, there were over 900 documented fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972 alone. The actual number was likely higher because many incidents were classified as accidents or combat losses and not recorded as fraggings. And because the circumstances of combat in Vietnam made it relatively straightforward to arrange for certain outcomes to be attributed to enemy action, the Army's response to this statistical reality was to track it, classify much of the tracking, and not discuss it publicly in terms that would convey its scale. What fragging represented, at the level of institutional function, was the complete dissolution of the authority structure that military operations require. Soldiers in Vietnam were killing their own officers, not in isolated cases attributable to individual psychopathology, but in numbers that constituted a systemic pattern. The officers being killed were not randomly distributed. They were disproportionately officers who were perceived as reckless with their soldiers' lives, officers who were pursuing body count metrics in ways that exposed their units to unnecessary casualties, officers who were more concerned with their own career advancement than with the welfare of the men they commanded. The soldiers doing the killing understood that they were operating within a system where official complaint mechanisms had proved ineffective, where the incentive structures that governed officer behavior were pushing those officers toward decisions that were getting people killed, and where the options for addressing this through legitimate channels were limited in ways that the situation did not permit. The Army investigated some of these incidents. It prosecuted fewer. Convictions were rare. The evidentiary challenges were genuine, because establishing that a specific individual had placed a grenade that had been intended for an officer was difficult in the chaotic environment of Vietnam. But the investigative limitations were also partly a product of the institutional reluctance to examine what fragging represented structurally. An honest examination of the fragging data would have required acknowledging that the relationship between the officer corps and the enlisted ranks had broken down to a degree that had no precedent in the modern American military. It would have required asking why it had broken down in these specific ways and not others, and the answers to that question would have led directly into the body count culture, the career incentive structures, the decisions about force employment that were being made at levels well above the units where the fraggings were occurring. The institutional response to this implication was to process individual incidents as individual incidents and not examine the pattern as a pattern in any form that would produce a public record. The soldiers who survived the units where these things happened carried home an understanding of military authority that was fundamentally different from the one they had brought with them. They had been inside a structure where the formal authority relationship between officers and enlisted men had been supplemented or replaced, in practice, by a parallel system of enforcement based on the credible threat of violence. They had learned that the command structure was not what it was described as being in the training manuals. They had watched it function in specific ways, under specific pressures, and had seen what it actually was when the formal protections of peacetime garrison life were removed. They were not encouraged to talk about this when they came home. There was no institutional framework for processing what they had experienced. The VA system in the early 1970s had no category for a veteran who had watched or participated in the killing of an American officer and had complex and unresolved feelings about whether that killing had been justified. The official record of the war had no space for that experience to exist within. Drug use in Vietnam became a significant operational problem by 1968 and a severe one by 1970 and 1971. And the way the military command handled it illustrates another dimension of the gap between official record and experienced reality. Heroin became widely available in South Vietnam in the late 1960s through supply networks that were tolerated or actively facilitated by elements of the South Vietnamese government and military command that the United States was officially supporting and training and equipping. The product being sold was extremely pure by the standards of what American soldiers might have encountered at home, and it was cheap, and it was available virtually everywhere in country. By 1971, the Army's own surveys were suggesting that somewhere between 10 and 15% of enlisted soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin regularly, and that rates of use across various illicit substances, including marijuana and amphetamines, were dramatically higher than that. These numbers were not publicized in ways that would have undermined the official narrative of a functioning, professional military force. Individual unit commanders dealt with the problem at the unit level, which meant that the responses were inconsistent and often inadequate, and that the data about the scope of the problem was fragmented across thousands of individual unit reports rather than aggregated in any way that would force it into a centralized reckoning. What the drug epidemic in Vietnam represented at a human level was a population of young men who had found a chemical solution to the problem of being required to function within a system that had systematically undermined their capacity to make sense of what they were doing. The soldiers who were using heroin in Vietnam in 1970 and 1971 were largely soldiers who had been in country long enough to understand the gap between what they had been told they were doing and what they were actually doing. They were operating in an environment where the metrics of success had been decoupled from any military reality that connected to the original stated purpose of the war. They were participating in operations that were generating body count numbers for reports that everyone in the operational chain understood were not reliable, but that continued to be required because the political and institutional structures at higher levels required them. And they were doing this while watching the South Vietnamese military, which they were supposed to be developing into a self-sufficient fighting force, demonstrate repeatedly that the timeline for self-sufficiency was not approaching in ways that the official reports described. Heroin removed the cognitive requirement to hold all of that simultaneously. It was a solution to an impossible epistemic situation, and it was a solution that the chain of command's response to was to treat as an individual disciplinary problem rather than a systemic indicator of something fundamental about the condition of the force. Soldiers who were caught using were subjected to disciplinary proceedings. Soldiers who became visibly non-functional due to addiction were processed out in ways that resulted in discharges that would affect their eligibility for veterans' benefits for decades. The question of what had produced the epidemic, whether the conditions soldiers were being asked to operate in were themselves a contributing factor, was not one that the institutional response engaged with seriously during the war. It was not engaged with seriously afterward either, for a long time. The veterans who came home addicted, or who came home having been heavy users who had managed to stop, were entering a civilian system that was not equipped to process what they were carrying. The VA was not prepared for the scale of substance use disorders among returning Vietnam veterans. The mental health frameworks available were not adequate to the specific character of what these men had experienced, and the cultural environment they were returning to, which was in the midst of a transition from initial anti-war sentiment to a more complicated form of post-war avoidance, did not offer many contexts in which their experience could be honestly examined. So it was not honestly examined at an institutional level for a considerable time. The individual soldiers carried it in the ways that individuals carry things when the institutions that are supposed to help them process difficult experiences are not available or not adequate. The Montagnard tribes of the Central Highlands represent a category of commitment and abandonment that received almost no attention in the official narrative of the war and has received relatively little attention since. The Montagnards, which is a French colonial term covering a diverse group of indigenous highland peoples, were recruited extensively by special forces units from the early 1960s onward. They were effective fighters. They knew the terrain with the intimacy of people whose families had lived in it for generations. They had their own reasons to resist the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, whose ideology and political program had limited space for their cultural practices and land claims. They were organized into civilian irregular defense groups under Special Forces guidance, and they fought with a commitment that the American soldiers who worked with them consistently described with genuine respect. The Special Forces soldiers who worked with the Montagnards developed relationships with them that went beyond the usual commander-subordinate or advisor-local force dynamic. They lived with them, ate with them, learned their languages in some cases, attended their ceremonies, and understood their situation in ways that the broader military command structure did not, and apparently was not particularly interested in doing. These soldiers understood as the war progressed and the political situation evolved, that the Montagnards were in a position of profound vulnerability. Their value to the American military was tactical and temporary. Their fate after any American withdrawal would be determined by Vietnamese political dynamics in which they had almost no leverage and very few allies. When the Nixon administration's Vietnamization policy accelerated the drawdown of American forces in the early 1970s, the question of what would happen to the Montagnard forces that had been recruited and trained and armed by special forces became a question that the command structure was not equipped to answer honestly. The official position was that the South Vietnamese government and military would absorb these forces and that their integration into the national defense structure would proceed in ways consistent with their security and interests. The Special Forces soldiers who had worked with the Montagnards and who understood the actual relationship between the Highland peoples and the lowland Vietnamese political establishment understood that this official position was not a realistic description of what was likely to happen. What they were told in various ways was that the transition was a political matter and not a military one, and that their job was to execute the military tasks assigned to them within the transition process and not to generate political complications by raising questions that went beyond those tasks. The soldiers who found this instruction inadequate, who tried to advocate within the system for their Montagnard comrades, generally found the advocacy went nowhere, because the decisions had been made at political levels that were not responsive to the concerns of Special Forces captains and majors, however well-founded those concerns were. The Montagnard soldiers who had fought alongside American forces, who had trusted the commitments that American soldiers had made to them, found themselves in the post-withdrawal situation that the Special Forces soldiers who knew them had predicted, which was one of systematic marginalization and in many cases violence at the hands of both the South Vietnamese government forces and later the unified Vietnamese state. The American soldiers who had worked with them came home carrying a specific kind of knowledge about what had been done in their name and with their participation. They had been part of a recruitment and commitment process that had ended in abandonment, and they knew it. And they had been told in various ways that the thing they knew was not something that the official narrative of the war's outcome had space for. Many of them have talked about it in veterans groups and oral history projects in the decades since. The institutional memory of the American military does not engage with it in any sustained way. Agent Orange and its aftermath occupy a position in the history of what soldiers were told to forget. That is unusual because in this case, the forgetting was eventually interrupted, partially, by litigation and political pressure over a period of decades. But the original suppression is instructive. Herbicide operations in Vietnam began in 1962 under Operation Ranch Hand and continued until 1971. The stated purpose was defoliation of jungle cover that could conceal enemy movement and destruction of crops that could feed enemy forces. The herbicides used, including the compound known as Agent Orange, which was a mixture of two herbicides contaminated with dioxin as a byproduct of the manufacturing process, were used at industrial scale. More than 19 million gallons of herbicide were sprayed over approximately 4.5 million acres of South Vietnam over the course of the program. The soldiers who were exposed to these chemicals during their service were not informed about the nature of the compounds they were being exposed to. In many cases, the exposure was direct. Soldiers walked through recently sprayed areas, handled the drums containing the herbicide, were present during aerial spraying operations. The official position at the time was that the herbicides being used were safe for human exposure at the concentrations involved in the defoliation program. This position was maintained by military and civilian health authorities for years after the war ended, while veterans who had been exposed were developing health conditions including various cancers, neurological disorders, and skin conditions that they attributed to their exposure, and while their children were being born with birth defects at rates that were not fully studied for a very long time. The story of how veterans fought to have their exposure-related health conditions recognized by the VA is a long one that involves decades of bureaucratic resistance, several major lawsuits, and repeated instances of the Department of Defense and the VA relying on scientific standards for proof of causation that were applied to Agent Orange claims with a consistency that was not applied to other benefit determinations. Documents that emerged through litigation and Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that concerns about the health effects of dioxin exposure had existed within the relevant agencies earlier than the official timeline of recognition admitted. The soldiers who were sick and who were trying to establish a connection between their service and their illness were operating against a system that had significant institutional interest in not recognizing that connection, because recognition would have liability implications and resource implications that the system was not positioned to welcome. What was being forgotten in real time, in the years immediately after the war, was that soldiers had been exposed to a substance whose safety had been asserted by official sources without adequate scientific basis, and that when those soldiers began to show health effects that were consistent with what independent scientific work on dioxin exposure predicted, the institutional response was to require a level of individual proof that the circumstances of military service made almost impossible to produce. The forgetting was not a decision made in a single moment. It was the cumulative product of a series of individual decisions by people operating within institutional frameworks that made it easier to defer and question and require more evidence than to acknowledge a systemic failure and its consequences. The soldiers who had been in areas that were later identified as heavily contaminated, soldiers who had been part of ranch hand crews, soldiers who had been in Quang Tri or Thua Tien or the Mekong Delta in the years when the spraying was most intensive, came home without being told what they had been exposed to, without being told to monitor their health for specific conditions, without being provided with any baseline information that would have allowed them to recognize exposure-related illness if it developed. They were carrying something that had been put into their bodies without their knowledge or meaningful consent, and they were carrying it without any institutional support for understanding what it was or what it might mean. The Tiger Force unit of the 101st Airborne Division conducted operations in the Song Vei Valley of Quang Ngai Province in 1967 that were investigated by the Army in 1971 and 1974, and that resulted in no prosecutions. The investigation documented acts that included the killing of civilians, the cutting of ears from bodies as trophies, and the execution of prisoners. The investigation was conducted over a period of months, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and produced a report that was classified and then remained classified for decades. The Toledo Blade newspaper published a series of investigative articles in 2003, more than 30 years after the events, that drew on declassified documents and interviews with veterans to reconstruct what the investigation had found. The articles won a Pulitzer Prize. What the Tiger Force story illustrates is the capacity of the military investigation system to conduct a thorough investigation, document findings that would in other contexts have produced criminal proceedings, and then absorb those findings into a classified record where they would remain for 30 years. The soldiers who had been part of Tiger Force, the ones who had participated in the documented actions and the ones who had witnessed them and the ones who had been in the unit and knew what was happening, all of them came home carrying knowledge of something that had an official existence in a classified Army report, but had no existence anywhere in the record that they or anyone else could access. The investigation had found what it found, and then the finding had been put somewhere and left there, and the soldiers were left with an experience that had been officially investigated and officially forgotten simultaneously. This is a pattern that repeats across the documented history of Vietnam War investigations. There was an investigation of the massacre at Thanh Phong in 1969, an operation for which former Senator Bob Kerrey was the commanding officer, that was documented in a Navy after-action report that described the unit killing civilians. The investigation did not produce prosecutions. The events remained within classified records for decades. There were investigations of numerous other incidents across the entire span of the war that produced similar outcomes. Documentation, classification, no prosecution, no public accounting. The soldiers involved understood, in many cases explicitly, that the investigation process was not oriented toward accountability, but toward containment. Its function was to put things in files, not to produce consequences. And if things were in files, they were, for practical purposes, forgotten, which is to say they had been converted from lived experience into managed information, and managed information can be controlled in ways that lived experience cannot. The Free Fire Zone policy, which designated certain areas of South Vietnam as zones in which any living thing was assumed to be a legitimate target and could be engaged without prior authorization, was another institutional structure that created experiences that the official record could not honestly contain. Free fire zones, which were officially called specified strike zones in military doctrine because the term free fire zone had generated negative press coverage, were established in areas that were considered to be entirely under enemy control and in which the civilian population was assumed to have either evacuated or allied itself with the enemy. In practice, the designation process was imprecise. The enforcement of evacuation orders in areas designated as free fire zones was inconsistent, and the assumption that everyone remaining in a designated zone was an enemy combatant was an assumption that the evidence on the ground frequently contradicted. Soldiers who operated in free fire zones were placed in a legal and moral framework that was, by its own terms, simpler than the rules of engagement that applied elsewhere. If you were in a free fire zone, anything that moved could be engaged. That was the rule. The rule was designed to reduce ambiguity in environments where contact with enemy forces was considered certain. What it actually did was create an operational environment in which the protections that international humanitarian law was supposed to extend to civilians had been administratively removed by a bureaucratic designation process. The soldiers who killed civilians in free fire zones because the zones had been designated as environments where everything was a target were not technically in violation of their rules of engagement. They were following the institutional logic that the system they were operating within had developed and authorized. The consequences of this structure were not something that the soldiers involved processed cleanly. Being told that something was permitted is not the same as having resolved the question of whether it was right. And soldiers who had been in free fire zones and had done things that the designation theoretically authorized were coming home with experiences that the authorization did not make any less complicated. Some of them had understood in the moment that the designation was a legal fiction that did not actually address the moral reality of what they were doing. Some of them had accepted the designation as genuine during the experience and were processing its meaning in the years after. The common element was that the official framework they had been operating within had not prepared them for the experience of having operated within it. The Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, which ran from March 1965 to November 1968 and dropped more than 800,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, generated its own category of suppressed experience. The pilots who flew the missions understood certain things about the campaign that were not reflected in the official assessments being produced in Washington. They understood that the target selection process was heavily influenced by political considerations that had little to do with military effectiveness, that targets were sometimes approved and sometimes withheld in patterns that reflected diplomatic calculations rather than operational logic, and that the restrictions on certain categories of targets meant that the campaign was being conducted in a way that the people designing it did not expect to be militarily decisive. They were flying extraordinarily dangerous missions, suffering significant losses, and doing so within a strategic framework that many of them had concluded was not actually aimed at the military objective it was nominally pursuing. The communication of this understanding upward through the chain of command was limited by the same structures that limited honest communication across the entire war. A pilot who expressed doubts about whether the campaign was working was not contributing to the information environment that the senior leadership wanted to operate in. The senior leadership had made commitments to political leaders who had made commitments to the public, and those commitments were based on an assessment of what Rolling Thunder would accomplish that was already proving inaccurate by 1966 and was clearly inaccurate by 1967. The institutional response to this inaccuracy was not to revise the assessment. It was to continue the campaign while generating metrics of its effectiveness that were more favorable than the operational reality supported. Naval aviators who were shot down and taken prisoner entered a different category of suppressed experience entirely. American prisoners of war in North Vietnam were subjected to treatment that the North Vietnamese government, with some technical justification, declined to characterize as torture, but that the men who experienced it described in consistent terms that leave little room for alternative interpretation. The military code of conduct required prisoners to provide only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. The North Vietnamese interrogators were working systematically to extract information and to produce statements from prisoners that could be used for propaganda purposes, and they had an extended time horizon and methods that were more than adequate to achieve their objectives with many of the men they held. What the prisoners were told, both explicitly in preparation for the possibility of capture and implicitly through the code of conduct they had been trained to follow, was that compliance beyond the minimum was unacceptable. What the experience of captivity in North Vietnam demonstrated was that the gap between what the training said was required of them and what the actual experience of prolonged coercive interrogation produced was significant. Men who had been genuinely committed to the code of conduct and genuinely prepared to accept whatever consequences its enforcement would bring found, over months and years of captivity, that the circumstances created by skilled interrogators using sustained psychological and physical pressure produced outcomes that the training had not been designed to accommodate honestly. When prisoners were repatriated beginning in February 1973, the Nixon administration managed the return in ways that maximized its political utility. The men came home as heroes, which many of them were by any reasonable standard. The detailed accounting of their captivity that some of them wanted to provide, the accounting that would have included what had actually happened in the interrogation rooms over months and years, was not something that the repatriation process was organized to produce or receive. Some veterans have spoken about this in the decades since, about returning to a celebration that was not designed to process the complexity of what they had experienced, and about understanding that the celebration served political purposes that required a particular version of their experience rather than the actual one. The soldiers who returned from Vietnam and tried to organize politically through organizations like Vietnam Veterans Against the War encountered a specific kind of institutional response that was itself a form of imposed forgetting. The FBI's COINTELPRO program had targeted left-wing organizations throughout the 1960s, and the veterans' anti-war movement was subjected to surveillance, infiltration, and disruption efforts that the government did not acknowledge at the time, and that became known only through the Church Committee investigations in 1975 and subsequent disclosures. Veterans who were trying to give public testimony about what they had experienced in Vietnam, testimony like that, presented at the Winter Soldier investigation in January and February of 1971 in Detroit, found that their accounts were dismissed in official contexts, that their credibility was questioned, and that the organizations they were working through were being monitored and in some cases disrupted by federal agencies. The Winter Soldier investigation was an event organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, at which over 100 veterans gave detailed testimony about war crimes they had witnessed or participated in. The testimony covered a wide range of incidents and practices across multiple units and theaters of operation. The congressional response was limited. The testimony was largely ignored by mainstream press at the time. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, whose chairman William Fulbright had been a critic of the war, did allow some veterans to testify in April of that year, including John Kerry. But the institutional response to the Winter Soldier testimony as a whole was to treat it as politically motivated rather than engage with its specific content. The veterans who had testified were told, in effect, that the forum in which they had chosen to speak was not one that the system recognized as legitimate, and that their accounts therefore did not require a serious response. What this meant in practice was that veterans who had participated in events and wanted to speak about them publicly found that speaking in certain contexts was treated as evidence of political unreliability rather than as testimony to be evaluated. The framing that emerged in response to the veterans' anti-war movement, the framing that cast their accounts as exaggerated or fabricated for political effect, did double work. It delegitimized the specific accounts being offered, and it also created an environment in which veterans who had not been involved in the anti-war movement, but who had their own complicated experiences to process, understood that those experiences were going to be received in a particular way if they were expressed publicly. The message, again, did not need to be stated explicitly. The environment communicated it clearly enough. The specific experience of the tunnel rats, the soldiers who were selected or volunteered to enter the Viet Cong tunnel systems that ran under portions of Three Corps and other areas, represents an extreme case of what the war could do to a person's capacity to process experience in conventional terms. The tunnel systems were extensive, in some cases covering dozens of miles of interconnected passages with multiple levels, sleeping areas, hospitals, weapons storage and command facilities. The soldiers who went into them went alone, or in small groups with a flashlight and a handgun, into spaces that were sometimes less than 2 feet in diameter, into an environment of complete darkness and complete disorientation, knowing that the person or persons they were looking for might be anywhere in the tunnel, and that the advantage of the space belonged entirely to the person who knew it. What the tunnel rats experienced in those spaces was something that the psychological frameworks available at the time had no vocabulary for. They were operating in a state of sensory and cognitive condition that was qualitatively different from conventional combat, where the threat environment is external, and the soldier's sensory apparatus is working as designed even under extreme stress. In the tunnels, the threat was everywhere and nowhere. The sensory environment was useless or actively misleading. The spatial orientation that the human nervous system relies on in almost all circumstances was completely unavailable. The men who went into tunnels regularly developed coping mechanisms and perceptual adaptations that were specific to that environment and did not transfer to any other context. When they came home, they had difficulty explaining what the experience had been. Not because they lacked the language exactly, but because the categories that civilian life offered for making sense of combat experience did not map onto what they had been inside. The conventional narrative of Vietnam combat that circulated in civilian culture in the late 1960s and 1970s involved jungle, heat, ambush, booby traps, things that were frightening but that existed in a sensory world that someone who had not been there could at least partially imagine. The tunnel experience existed in a completely different sensory and psychological register, and the difficulty of communication was compounded by the fact that the specific psychological effects of operating in those conditions repeatedly over time were not something that any medical or psychological support system was prepared to address. The accelerated pacification campaign of 1968 and 1969 produced its own layer of suppressed experience. The campaign followed the Tet Offensive, which had significantly damaged the Viet Cong's organizational capacity at the village level by drawing cadre out of their covert roles for the conventional attacks of January and February of 1968. The APC was designed to exploit this organizational disruption by rapidly extending South Vietnamese government control into previously contested or enemy-controlled areas. It succeeded by many metrics. The number of villages rated as relatively secure by the Hamlet evaluation system increased dramatically between 1968 and 1969. Robert Comer, who ran the civilian pacification program under the program called CORDS, described the results as representing genuine progress toward a stable South Vietnamese political order. The soldiers and advisors who were on the ground during the APC understood that the Hamlet evaluation system ratings were, to put it gently, not a reliable measure of actual political loyalty or actual security conditions. The ratings were generated by district advisors who were evaluating villages on a set of criteria that were partly objective and partly subjective, and whose administration created incentives for favorable ratings. A district that was showing rapidly improving HES scores was a district where the advisory program appeared to be working. A district showing flat or declining scores was a district where questions would be asked. The advisors who were generating these scores were not uniformly dishonest, but they were operating within an evaluation system that they understood rewarded certain outcomes and that they were being asked to use as the primary metric of their own effectiveness. The villages that were rated as secure during the APC were in many cases villages where South Vietnamese government presence had been physically extended, but where the Viet Cong political and organizational infrastructure remained intact at a covert level. The distinction between surface security metrics and actual political conditions was one that anyone with experience in the villages understood, and it was a distinction that the HES was not designed to capture. The advisors who understood this and who tried to communicate it upward through official channels found that the communication was received as a failure of optimism rather than as accurate reporting. The system was producing numbers that showed progress, and the numbers were moving in the right direction, and questioning the validity of the numbers was not something that helped anyone. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, and when the American military withdrew, and when the political framework that the Accords had established began to break down over the following 2 years, the people who had been inside the system understood that what the Accords had produced was not a sustainable political settlement, but a delay. They had watched the South Vietnamese military and government function at close range for years, and they had produced honest assessments of what that function looked like when they were asked for honest assessments in contexts where honesty was safe, and those assessments had not been what the political requirements of the moment needed them to be. The advisors who had spent years in the field came home knowing that the outcome they were watching develop from a distance was one that a reading of their own honest reporting would have predicted, if the reporting had been attended to honestly. The experience of African American soldiers in Vietnam constitutes a dimension of the war that the dominant official narrative consistently underweighted and, in some respects, actively suppressed. African Americans served in Vietnam at rates that exceeded their proportion of the general population through the mid-1960s, partly because of the operation of selective service deferment policies that systematically favored men with college educations and employment in certain occupational categories. The combat casualty rates among African American soldiers in the early years of the war reflected this, with black soldiers dying at rates disproportionate to their numbers in the general population. This disparity drew attention, and after 1967 the military made adjustments that brought the casualty rates more closely into alignment with population proportions. But the conditions that had produced the disparity remained. Black soldiers in Vietnam were operating in a military institution that carried all of the racial dynamics of American society in the late 1960s, plus the specific stresses of a combat environment, plus the context of the civil rights movement and the urban uprisings of 1965 through 1968 that were reshaping the political landscape at home. The racial climate within many units was genuinely hostile. Confederate flags were displayed openly in some barracks. Racial incidents were common. The formal integration of the military that had been mandated in 1948 had produced an institution that was technically desegregated, but that had not remotely resolved the racial dynamics that desegregation was supposed to address. The command structure's response to racial incidents in Vietnam was, in the assessment of the studies that examined it afterward, inadequate, inconsistent, and often counterproductive. The specific experience of black soldiers who came home in the late 1960s and early 1970s was one of returning to a society that was in the midst of a profound racial conflict, having served in a war that many in the black community regarded as unjust, having experienced an institution that had not treated them equitably, and encountering a veterans' support infrastructure that was not designed with their specific circumstances in mind. The VA system was not adequately prepared for this population. The civilian support structures were not adequately prepared. The political moment was not one in which the specific experience of black Vietnam veterans was something that either the mainstream pro-war narrative or the mainstream anti-war narrative was positioned to receive accurately. The soldiers who served in the final years of the war, after the drawdown had begun and after the institutional collapse of morale that the Army's own internal studies were documenting by 1971, were in some respects in the worst position of all. They were serving in a military that had largely given up on the idea that what it was doing was going to produce the outcome it had been committed to producing. The senior leadership understood, by 1971, that the war's political resolution was going to be determined by negotiations, and that the military operations being conducted were serving a political holding function rather than a genuine military purpose. The soldiers in the field were conducting operations to maintain a tactical position whose strategic relevance had become increasingly difficult to articulate. The breakdown of unit cohesion and discipline in the later years of the war is documented in the Army's own internal studies with unusual frankness. These studies, conducted by officers who were genuinely alarmed by what they were observing, described a force in which drug use was endemic. Racial tensions were severe, refusal of orders was becoming more common. and the relationship between enlisted soldiers and the officer corps had been damaged in ways that would take years to address. The studies were classified and internally circulated and were not available to the public for decades. The public narrative of the war in its final American phase was shaped by other things entirely. The studies were accurate. The public narrative was not. What the soldiers of the later years carried home was the experience of serving in an institution that knew it had failed at its stated purpose and was continuing anyway for reasons that were entirely political. They had been the bodies in the field while the political machinery processed the question of how to end the commitment without accepting the consequences of failure. The people who made the decisions about how to manage that process, about how to maintain enough military activity to support the negotiating position, about what combination of operations and withdrawals would produce a politically viable outcome. Those people were not in the field. The people in the field were the ones bearing the cost of the political management of failure, and they knew it, and they were told in various ways that what they knew was not something that the institutional management of the moment had space for. The PTSD diagnosis, which was introduced into the psychiatric diagnostic framework in 1980, is sometimes described as a recognition of what Vietnam veterans had been experiencing for years. It was also, in a different way, a containment. Having a diagnosis is not the same as having an explanation. The symptoms that were categorized as PTSD in the DSM-3 were real symptoms that real people were experiencing, and having a name for them and a category for treatment was in some respects better than not having those things. But the diagnostic framework also had the effect of locating the problem in the individual rather than in the institution, the war, or the society. It created a way of talking about what Vietnam veterans were experiencing that focused on their psychological response to their experience rather than on the nature of the experience itself. The experience could remain unexamined as long as the response to the experience was being treated. The veterans who got the diagnosis and received treatment sometimes found the treatment helpful. They also sometimes found that the treatment was designed to help them function within normal civilian life and was not designed to help them think clearly about what had happened and why, and who was responsible for what. Those were questions that the mental health system was not equipped to address, because they were not psychological questions. They were historical and political and institutional questions. The psychological system's response to them was to convert them into psychological symptoms and treat the symptoms. The underlying questions remained unaddressed by that process. The specific experience of the medics and corpsmen who served in Vietnam has received less attention than the combat experience of infantrymen, and what it was is in some ways distinctive enough to deserve separate consideration. The medics and corpsmen were responsible for keeping men alive in the immediate aftermath of their being shot or blown up or burned in conditions where the available resources were not adequate to the injuries being presented, where the decisions being made had consequences that were immediate and irreversible, and where the psychological support for making those decisions was almost non-existent. They were young men, often in their early 20s, with training that was thorough by the standards of what could be conveyed in a training pipeline, but that was not equivalent to the clinical experience of surgeons or emergency physicians, doing work that was equivalent to or more demanding than what surgeons and emergency physicians do in hospital settings. The long-term psychological impact on medics and corpsmen is an area where the research, most of which was conducted decades after the war, finds consistently elevated rates of the conditions associated with traumatic exposure. The men who were doing the trauma care were also, in many cases, in combat environments where they were receiving fire while trying to provide care. They were doing their work without the institutional and psychological buffer of a hospital setting, without the professional community that supports medical practitioners in civilian contexts, and without any structured mechanism for processing what they were experiencing. They came home with the same inadequate support systems that all Vietnam veterans came home with, and they had been carrying something specific that the general veteran support structure was not equipped to address. What they had been carrying, in many cases, was the specific knowledge of individual deaths. The medic who watches a man die from an injury that would have been survivable in a better-equipped environment knows something specific about the relationship between resources and outcomes that a person who has not been in that position does not know. The medic who makes a triage decision in the field, who decides in real time which of the men in front of him is the most salvageable and concentrates resources on him and watches the others die, has made decisions that the frameworks for medical ethics available to him in training were not adequate to process. The person who comes home from that and is asked how he is doing by people who mean well but have no context for the question is being asked to translate something for which there is no available translation. The South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians who worked most closely with American forces and who were left behind when the evacuation occurred in April 1975 represent the final and in some ways most complete expression of what the war did to commitments and what the official American response to broken commitments looked like in practice. The South Vietnamese military personnel who had worked alongside American advisors, the intelligence assets who had operated under CIA direction, the civilian officials who had administered programs under American guidance, the interpreters and local employees who had been attached to American units, all of them had made commitments based on an understanding that the American commitment to their country was durable in ways that the events of April 1975 demonstrated it was not. The evacuation from Saigon on April 29 and 30, 1975 succeeded in removing most of the Americans present in the country and some of the Vietnamese who had the most direct and visible connection to the American presence. It did not and could not remove the much larger population of Vietnamese who had worked within the American-supported system and who were now facing the consequences of the political transition. The re-education camps that the new unified Vietnamese government established in the months and years following April 1975 held hundreds of thousands of former South Vietnamese military and government personnel. The conditions in those camps and the duration of detention varied, but for many former South Vietnamese officials and military officers, the experience lasted years and in some cases more than a decade. The American military and intelligence personnel who had worked with these individuals, who had made relationships with them over years of shared work, who in many cases had genuine personal commitments to their welfare, came home knowing that the people they had worked with were in re-education camps or worse. They had been part of a system that had made commitments that the system then did not keep. The institutional response to this knowledge was to process it as a consequence of the political outcome, rather than as a reflection of the reliability of the commitments that had been made. The commitments had been made by individuals and by institutions on behalf of a political project that had ended in a particular way, and the people who had trusted those commitments were bearing the consequences of the ending in specific and traceable ways that the American institutional response did not engage with in any sustained way. The veterans who returned from Vietnam in the years between 1965 and 1975 came home to a country that was in the process of deciding what to think about the war, and the country's process of deciding was not responsive to what the veterans actually knew about the war. The anti-war movement had its version of what the war had been, which was morally clear in ways that the experience itself had not been. The pro-war faction had its version, which was morally clear in a different direction. The veterans who had been inside the experience understood that neither version was accurate, because neither version had space for the specific ambiguity of what they had lived through, the specific texture of a war that had been characterized by institutional dishonesty from its highest levels, by metrics that measured nothing real, by commitments that were made without the intention of being kept, by official versions of events that bore little relationship to the events themselves. The country moved on from Vietnam in the way that countries move on from wars that they would prefer not to examine too closely. There was a period of active avoidance that lasted roughly through the late 1970s, during which the cultural production around Vietnam was limited and the political discussion was constrained by the desire of most of the relevant political actors not to be accountable for the outcome. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought the beginning of cultural processing through films and books, and eventually the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982. which was itself a contested process that revealed how much disagreement remained about what the war had meant and how it should be represented. What did not happen, in any systematic or institutionally serious way, was an examination of the specific things that soldiers had been told to forget. The mechanisms of suppression that had operated during the war continued to operate in modified forms afterward. Classified materials remained classified for decades. Official histories were produced that incorporated the information management practices that had characterized the official record during the war itself. The soldiers who had carried specific knowledge of specific things found that the mechanisms for publicly processing that knowledge were limited in particular ways, that the forums in which testimony could be given were not ones that the political establishment was organized to take seriously, and that the passage of time converted urgent knowledge into historical footnote in ways that served certain institutional interests. The body count numbers that had been sent up through the chain of command, the Phoenix program statistics, the Hamlet evaluation system scores, the Rolling Thunder damage assessments, the post-operation reports from units in free fire zones, all of that information had shaped the decisions of political leaders who were themselves receiving it through layers of institutional processing that had removed whatever accuracy it might originally have contained. The people making decisions about troop levels and operational tempo and negotiating positions were working with information that was, in significant respects, false. This is not a retrospective judgment. People within the system knew it at the time. The knowledge was contained, managed, and prevented from reaching the levels where it would have required a response, because a response would have required acknowledging that the system was not producing the outcomes it claimed to be producing. The consequence of this was that the war continued for reasons that were entirely political long after the military rationale had dissolved. The soldiers who were in the field in 1971 and 1972 were there because the political management of the war's end required them to be there, not because their presence was accomplishing anything that anyone with access to accurate information about the situation would have identified as a military objective. They were casualties of a political management process, and the people who were managing the process understood this at some level, and the response to that understanding was to ensure that it did not produce public accountability. The last American combat soldier to die in Vietnam died on January 27, 1973, the day the Paris Peace Accords were signed, before the ceasefire had taken effect. The last American personnel to leave Saigon departed on April 29, 1975. In the 2 years between those dates, the war continued without the American military ground presence that had defined it for a decade. The South Vietnamese military fought and took casualties and eventually was unable to hold the line that the Paris Accords had nominally established. The North Vietnamese forces, which had never stopped fighting, continued their operations in ways that the Accords had prohibited, but that the international monitoring mechanisms had no capacity to prevent. The outcome that the American military and political establishments had been trying to delay through various means for years arrived on the schedule that anyone reading the accurate assessments rather than the official ones would have predicted. The soldiers who were no longer in Vietnam when it ended were watching from a distance, having been told that their service had been part of a process that would produce a stable South Vietnamese state, watching that process reach its conclusion. Some of them had come to terms, in various ways and through various psychological processes, with what they had done and seen and experienced. Others had not. The ones who had not were carrying things that the society they had come back to had not found mechanisms to receive, and the things they were carrying had no official existence because the official record of the war was not a record of what had actually happened. It was a record of what the system had required to be reported, which was a different thing, and it remained that different thing for the rest of their lives. The war ended, and the records were sealed, and the veterans aged and the country moved on, and the specific experiences that had constituted the war as it was actually lived continued to exist in the minds of the people who had lived them, without institutional home, without official acknowledgement, without the kind of public reckoning that would have required examining what had been done in the name of objectives that had never been clearly defined and had not been achieved. The military in the years after Vietnam worked systematically to address the institutional failures that had characterized the war, and those efforts produced significant changes in doctrine, in training, in the relationship between the military establishment and the political leadership that employs it. What they did not produce was an honest accounting of what those failures had cost the people who had been inside them. The last American military advisor was withdrawn from South Vietnam in March 1975. The war had been ongoing in various forms since 1955. 20 years of American involvement at various levels of intensity and commitment produced an outcome that the official assessments had consistently predicted would not occur. The outcome had been predicted accurately by people who had access to accurate information and who had tried, within the limits of the system they were operating in, to communicate what they knew. The communication had not reached the levels where it would have changed the decisions being made. The decisions had been made on the basis of the information the system produced, which was the information the system needed to produce, and the war had continued on the basis of those decisions until the continuation was no longer politically sustainable. The veterans who are still alive carry what they carry. The ones who are gone carried it with them. The official record of the war continues to exist in archives and official histories and the various forms in which institutional memory maintains itself, and it continues to differ from the war that was actually fought in the ways it always differed. And the gap between the two is not something that the official record has any mechanism for closing. The last combat death attributed to the Vietnam War in American records occurred in May 1975 during the Maya Gez incident, 15 days after the fall of Saigon. 18 American servicemen died in an operation to recover a merchant vessel that had already been released by its captors before the operation began. The information indicating that the vessel had been released was available to decision-makers before the operation was ordered. The operation was ordered anyway. 41 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing in the operation. The crew of the Maya Gez was recovered unharmed.